Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to EPC Update, our regular look at the key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a Senior Advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week are, and I'm delighted to welcome him, Herman Van Rompuy, President Emeritus of the European Council and President of the European Policy Centre. Great to have you back, Herman. Thank you so much for joining us. We also have with us a regular guest, Amanda Paul, Senior Policy Analyst at the EPC, and as always, Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies, and Fabian Zuleeg, the Chief Executive of the EPC. Our discussion today is going to focus, as the title of this session implies, on the way forward for Ukraine and the EU27. We're going to analyse recent developments, what the prospects are looking like, how the EU is responding to those immediate crisis issues, and also longer term implications. So lots to discuss. As always, totally interactive, questions from me to our panel, and then I hope a little later on also from all of you. If you want to ask a question, if you want to write it, please use the Q&A box, not the chat, the Q&A, and please be as brief as possible. If you would prefer to speak, please click on the raised hands button and I will open your mic and ask you to do the same when I give you the floor. Again, if you can be as brief as possible, given how much ground we have to cover today. Amanda, before we begin to analyse and assess the EU's response, can you just bring us up to speed on where we are in terms of EU discussions around sanctions and other issues?
Yeah, thank you, Jacki. First of all, I think that the EU has managed to do so far much better than many people believed would be possible. What we've seen so far has been important military, financial and humanitarian assistance, as well as already several rounds of sanctions. But in my opinion, a lot of this has taken far too long, and it's still not enough. The EU shouldn't be looking for plaudits. What they should be doing is actually listening very closely every night to what President Zelensky is saying. Now, the EU needs to be looking now to have a really robust long-term assistance and support with much quicker solutions on many issues. First and foremost, this means a non-stop flow of heavy arms into Ukraine. This is really vital. This is something that the US has understood and is actually doing. And the EU needs to be discussing this and how they can further step up on this. I think it's also really crucial at this point, this week particularly, that the EU needs to maintain a united front, because we can start to see that this united front is starting to crumble. And this has been exposed in the discussions that we're hearing over the last few days regarding the next round of sanctions, which are supposed to be an oil embargo. There are clear divergences and the progress is being slowed down because of this. The list of countries that is asking for exemptions and derogations is growing longer and longer. Now, it's really important that this oil embargo is implemented as soon as possible, but it's not just about the oil embargo. There needs to be additional steps, because the oil embargo is one thing, but what the EU needs to be doing now is additional steps to stop Russia from finding alternative buyers for this oil. And the most efficient way to do this, if I may say so, is to stop EU-owned tankers from handling Russian oil, or EU-based insurers from underwriting shippers. This is what needs to be done. For example, Greece is responsible for the shipping of the majority of Russian oil. So it's really crucial that these things are prioritized and that they're done at this point.
Thank you. But of course, that shipping proposal that the Commission had made, as I understand it, withdrawn for the time being because of objections, most notably from Greece. So, as you say, has done much better. Herman Van Rompuy, Amanda's overall assessment, has done much better than most people believed, but it's taken too long and it's not enough. Before we delve into some of the detail, is that your assessment of the situation? Really, some of what the EU has done has been quite remarkable. But has it been enough?
Yes, and as you said, and as Amanda said, the European response was first and of all firm, unexpectedly firm. Also, I would say from a Russian point of view. I think that the Russians had mostly counted on a weak reaction. I'm speaking now about what's happened after the 24th of February, a weak reaction after the weak and divisive responses immediately following the annexation of Crimea in the spring of 2014. So compared to that, we reacted in a totally different way. And they expected a weak reaction as we had 7 years ago. And stronger sanctions did not come. I was responsible at that time in the European Council. Stronger sanctions did not come until August 2014, after the downing of the Malaysian airplane over Ukraine. And so Russia hoped for a weak reaction from France also, and from Germany. Don't forget that, who had advocated some kind of reset of EU-Russian relations in a meeting of the European Council on June 2021. So Russia forgot that the two countries did not make it then. But given what happened in 2014, and having in mind the Franco-German rapprochement efforts just a year ago, they made a huge miscalculation. And what happened was the moral horror evoked by the inhuman images of the war, the flow of refugees, the tough stance of the Baltic states and of Poland, and of course also the anti-Putin course of Biden. Imagine this crisis with President Trump and not with President Biden. And all these have led to a tough stance on the part of the Union and a part of the West as a whole. So it's a combination of bottom-up and top-down. So you always can say it is too little and too late. It depends on your starting position. In any case, from a Russian point of view, I think they will surprise everybody. When you take a Ukrainian perspective, of course, then I understand that they say you can do more. But we did unprecedented things, but now comes the most difficult stage, is where we have also to hurt our own population. And that's the most difficult thing. You have ideology, you have strategic concerns about weapons and so on, but when you hit your own population, then it's becoming really difficult for national leaders. Of course, for Hungary, it is a different story, because there is a mix of national interests and this special relationship with Russia, but also for other countries. They are against Putin, they are against the war, they're very supportive until now, but they are hesitating now on some new aspects of the oil embargo. I'm not speaking about gas even, because then they will enter in internal political trouble, and we have to understand it to some extent what's happening in those countries, because we need also moral support for the war in Ukraine. So it is a difficult balance to achieve between these internal concerns and the European-wide interest. It takes some time, but I'm confident that we, at the end of the day, will find a common ground. But it is now the most difficult period since February the 24th, for the reasons I mentioned. But agreeing with 27 is always difficult. But I think we will discuss it, Jacki, later on in our conversation. But we are now coming close to the limits of what unanimity rule can and can't and cannot. We are coming close to that. And if at the end of the day, it is one country that is blocking all the rest, that is unacceptable. It's unacceptable, not only politically, but also in terms of the rules, decision-making rules of the European Union. But we are not at that stage.
We will come back on that. But your assessment at the moment that, for example, on the oil embargo and the latest proposal, of course, rejected, that would have given Hungary and Slovakia an extra year to everyone else, the Czech Republic an extra 6 months. Hungary have said doesn't go far enough and indeed have suggested they should be exempted entirely. We saw Ursula von der Leyen traveling to see Viktor Orban, doesn't seem to have produced anything, although the Commission's saying it wasn't intended, it was more of a scoping exercise. Janis, do you share Herman's sense that at this stage we still can find agreements? He says we're close to the limits of what we can agree on, but at this stage there is a way through. And what is your overall assessment of where we are so far? Are you in the sort of glass half full camp, it's remarkable what has been done, or the glass half empty, it's nowhere near far enough?
Well, if you force me to put myself into one or the other, I would say the glass is half full, because I agree that if you look into, and I don't want to repeat what has already been said, but if you look into what has happened over the past weeks, past months, we see that there is a more united, a firmer reaction to what happened and what is happening in Ukraine. So that is something which is very positive. On the other hand, I think, and that's also something which Amanda already highlighted, this is no time for self-congratulation. There's more that needs to be done. There's increasing pressure that needs to be put on Putin, put on Moscow. There is an increasing support needed for Ukraine in military terms, in moral terms, in political terms, in many terms. So there's more that has to be done. And it's the sanctions are one key element in that, but it's not the only element. But even there is certain progress. If we remember the debate we had a month ago, this was very much about gas and it was yes or no. Now we have more of a nuanced approach. I think that has led to an ability to progress also when it comes to sanctions, but there's much more that can be done and probably will have to be done as time progresses. For me, I agree with Herman that now is a more difficult period, but I still believe that decisions can be taken. What I worry about is where we will be in 3, 6 months or 9 months time. Because what has been the main motivating factor between the EU 27 to find an agreement at the end of the day was the fear factor, the fear of the situation running out of control, the situation worsening in Ukraine, but also potentially worsening with respect to the overall relationship with Russia and other countries, maybe even within the European Union being dragged into this. So the fear factor has been a very strong motivating factor. The question is, how will the situation look like in 3 or in 6 months' time? And I stop by saying this last remark is that I hope that in 3, 5, or 7 years' time, we will not again find ourselves at a moment where we say we should have drawn more stronger lessons from what happened in 2022. Now, a lot of people are saying, look at those who were telling us in 2008, Georgia, who were telling us in 2014, Crimea, that we need to prepare for more to come. And these people were right. So I hope that in 5, 7, whatever years' time, we will not look back and say we didn't go far enough. So we need a lot of reform stamina.
Let's talk a little bit more about what we need to do to make sure that doesn't happen. But Fabian, you have warned before when we've discussed these issues on updates about a concern that people weren't really waking up to how fundamentally everything has changed. Do you now feel that recognition is there? And are you with those, I think everybody who's saying, you know, it has been remarkable, a bit of differences in terms of how, whether it's a B+ or an A- so far, but are you confident that the EU can do ultimately what it needs to in recognition of how dramatic the situation is? Or do you fear that those cracks we're beginning to see appear are going to get wider?
And firstly, I think maybe I'll try to be in between both and have it both half full and half empty, because I think we have also seen a period after the initial action where things slowed down, where particular countries, and pointing the finger here at Germany, not only, but particularly Germany, was not going as far as was necessary at the time. And it took intense pressure to get Germany to the point where, for example, it is now supplying the heavy weapons which are needed. So it hasn't been smooth in that sense. I think the other point, which I would also highlight on the more negative side, is we shouldn't lose sight of the cost of living crisis, because that is really what is dominating a lot of the debate at the population level, who are not that engaged in the geostrategic, geopolitical level, but they can see that prices are increasing. They can see that there are problems with suppliers. They can see that their own life is going to be impacted. And that's really when it's going to be also easier for European leaders not to make the right decisions, but to fall back to something which we've seen many times in the European Union, where leaders are saying, well, we can't do that because my population will not support that. And I think this is a very dangerous moment because of those reasons. Can we do it? Can we also make the long-term decisions, which I think we haven't really started yet? And in many ways, they are more difficult because they are the more fundamental ones. They are the structural ones where we have to address very long-reaching questions around, for example, what is the balance between action at the European level, action at the national level? We haven't started with those yet, and that's going to be very difficult with this backdrop. Can we do it? Yes, of course we can do it, but it is a choice. And I think this is where I would say we are now at a crossroads. That will also be influenced of what happens on the ground in Ukraine. But if this conflict becomes, it's not going to be a frozen conflict, but if it becomes more localized, if the attention of the press starts to get less, if we start to have less fear, as Janis was mentioning, of this spilling over into other areas, are we then going to have the motivation, the drive to deal with these long-term tricky questions?
Thank you. I'm just picking up on that Germany point. And Herman, if I could come back to you on the politics of this, because it is striking. You said now comes the most difficult stage because it's when it's going to hurt our own populations. We saw Germany's very cautious response to a start, but actually the public, despite knowing it's going to hurt them, wanting more. And we've seen the Chancellor's popularity slump and trouble in local elections because of it. So this is an interesting case, really, where actually public opinion, even knowing and seeing some of the impacts of this crisis, is calling for more, and politicians that are hesitant are being punished or losing popularity. How do you read that? And in terms of as we move forward, do you think now Germany has moved, it will stay moved, if that's not the right way to put it, but is this decisive, this shift to recognizing that it needed to do more?
Mm-hmm. But as I said, the support of the pressure put on Germany and other countries, by the way, is this pressure is coming from the bottom. Yeah. So a bottom-up exactly. Pressure. Of course, there are also external pressures, and the strong stance of America, President Biden in this issue, he's supported even by the Republicans, is also external pressure on some of our countries, especially on Germany. So there's a combination of bottom-up and top-down pressure. But now comes when I say population can be hurt, it's nothing to do with the previous stage. Now it's about energy, it's about prices, it's about availability of energy. So this is much more direct. And of course, we are now in the summer. Imagine that we were in the winter, it would be a totally different situation. That's why I'm saying now comes the real test for political courage. Before that, it had more to do with ideology, with your views on geopolitics and so on. But now it's about your own people, and those decisions are much more difficult to make because you need to go against part of the population. Don't forget that in the French elections, Marine Le Pen got 42% of the votes. In my view, it had not so much to do with migration, or for sure not about Europe. That was not really an issue. It had only to do with, or almost only to do with purchasing power.
Yeah.
Only to do with that. And in some of our countries, it's the key issue where populists are not in power. The traditional parties are really in trouble today. The energy prices were rising before the 24th of February, but now there's an additional push. There's an additional push, as if the whole of the energy price increases were due to the war in Ukraine. So for a national politician, I repeat what I said, this is a more difficult decision to take than before. Before it had more to do with your concept of your relations with Russia and with ideology. Now it is about the real concerns of your own voters, your own citizens. Absolutely. That you have to overcome. You have to overcome, and that there's a potential of political courage in Europe today, and some have shown it in a very clear way. But we are with 27. Some are more exposed to more dependent from Russian oil and gas than other countries. I'm not speaking again about the case of Hungary, which is a totally different case because there is a hypocritical mix of so-called national interests and of so-called geopolitical views on the relationship with Russia.
Absolutely. I want to come back on those asymmetric impacts in a moment, that cost of living issue. But Amanda, perhaps you could pick up for us a question I had for you about yesterday and the Victory Day parade in Russia and Vladimir Putin's speech, where we were expecting, or many feared, we would see a dramatic escalation of the situation. Rather, it was somewhat muted. I wonder what you read into that. And Philippe Hamro-Drutz in our audience says, what risk do you estimate that the Russian aggression, the war in Ukraine, could escalate to other parts of Europe, to the north, to Finland, which is a neighboring country to Russia, and of course, as we know, will probably these days apply for membership of NATO, Philippe asks. So just your assessment, if you would, of yesterday's speech and why it wasn't what we expected, or what many expected, and whether you fear that he is intent on moving this to other parts of Europe, most notably the questioner asked to Finland.
I mean, I think now that we should learn to, expect perhaps the unexpected sometimes from President Putin, and the fact that he didn't make or didn't say some of the things that we were expecting him to say yesterday doesn't mean that he is not intent on further escalating this conflict, because I believe this is exactly what he is planning to do. I mean, yesterday should have been, a much bigger celebration based on what Putin was expecting. Unfortunately for him, or fortunately for us, I could say, the superb Ukrainian resistance to Russian aggression has made it impossible for Russia so far to achieve any of the goals that it set out to back in February. But of course, this probably means it's much more likely that the Russians are going to double down on their efforts and become more focused on particularly attacking civilians, infrastructure, carrying out wars against humanity and these sorts of issues. And also, as you just asked, in terms of the neighbors, I mean, there was already this incident, this attack in Transnistria, this part of Moldova. So it's very possible that this could further escalate, not just in Moldova, but elsewhere, because at the end of the day, Putin is determined to use whatever he can or do whatever he can to achieve a victory. This victory isn't going to be coming in the short term. it could be years actually, and hopefully it's going to be, or it will be, a Ukrainian victory. This isn't questionable, but this is why it's so important at the moment that we continue to see the full support from the EU, the Transatlantic Alliance, and other Western partners. It doesn't need to slow down, it needs to increase. And I do think, I think there's only a handful of countries that are actually ready to do whatever it takes at the moment. And this is really a really short-sighted approach. EU leaders, all of them, need to wake up, because let's remember that crimes against humanity are being committed every single hour. Just 1 minute, just one last thing. I just want to remind everybody that as we sit here today, there's 2,000 Ukrainian military forces trapped in a steel factory in Mariupol. And if something isn't done to help them, more diplomacy or whatnot to try and get them out of there, they are going to die.
Thank you very much indeed. Fabian, on this question of the asymmetric impacts of all of this that Herman was just talking about, and taking aside, as he said, Hungary having other reasons, games it is playing with the European Union on this issue, but there are countries that are much worse impacted if there is a full oil embargo with the gas situation because of varying dependencies. And that, of course, then playing into the cost of living crisis and how severe it is in different countries. Does the EU need to do more? It's trying to do so on the sanctions package by giving some countries a bit longer on the oil embargo, but more broadly, does it need to do more to take account of these asymmetric impacts?
I think the EU definitely has to do more, and that's on a variety of different levels. Firstly, I think it's important to recognize that this is not only about EU countries. This is a global issue where a number of the most vulnerable countries in the world are being already impacted by fuel and food crisis. And there, I think it is extremely important for humanitarian reasons, but also for political reasons, that the European Union is seen to be addressing this. Now, within the European Union, I think we also have to look not only at asymmetric impact, but also at the asymmetric capacity to absorb the costs which are coming with that. We have a situation where some countries, yes, are going to be impacted more, but arguably countries like Germany also have a much greater capacity to deal with that kind of impact. Yes, it's going to be difficult, but it is something which has to be done in a war. But this is, I think, where also communication plays an important role and leadership plays an important role. I don't think that the debate in Germany is really reflecting that this is a war and that Germany is actually a combatant. Not in the front line, not in the way, as Amanda was reminding us, that we have fighters there who are fighting for their lives, but it is a combatant. And that is something which also has to be transmitted to the population, because I do think that Germans are able and willing to take some of the pain which comes with this, as long as they see that there's a historic, a moral responsibility to address this issue. It is not going to be economically beneficial for Germany, but I think there's a recognition that in a war, that is the case. And that also means then finding mechanisms of helping those countries within the European Union which don't have the capacity to absorb some of these impacts.
And what
so I think we should have, for example, I think we should be looking at very generous loan facilities backed by the European Union, which enables countries to make the switch from the no longer reliable sources of supply to other sources. We also need to look at, are there parts of populations we have to compensate in certain ways? Are there measures we can take, for example, in the energy sector, which can ease some of the pressure? Now, none of this is going to resolve the cost of living crisis. None of this is going to get us to a point where we don't have to bear the cost of what is happening in Russia, in Ukraine, caused by Russia. But we can actually help to mitigate some of these effects. but we need to have the political will to do that.
Thank you. Janis, just going back to what Herman said, and in a moment I want to come on to the longer term implications, and this really does link when he said it takes a time when you're discussing these difficult issues to find a balance, to find the right way forward. But he said, I'm confident at this stage we can still find the common grounds, but we're reaching the limits of that. We'll come back to the implications of beyond those limits. Would you agree with that assessment? Would you expect there will be an agreement on the oil embargo before long? And just 2 words, if you would, both about your take on where Germany is now, and also France, following the election, Macron's victory. Of course, he is facing parliamentary elections. So whether we see, does his victory, do you think we will see him doing things differently now that he's been re-elected, or will it make little difference to his approach?
These are many questions at once. So let me start with one with respect to oil embargo. I think that we have seen that things are moving. There are now attempts to also persuade those in the council who are the most difficult ones. We saw von der Leyen yesterday in Budapest trying to strike a deal, although we were told that this was not an attempt to strike a deal, but obviously it was. I think that we will see progress with respect to oil embargoes. The other question that still then remains is how we deal with gas, but that comes afterwards. But I think that we will see progress. Second, just in addition to what Fabian responded to your question of what can be done in economic terms, I think there are 3 things that can be done. One is to readjust the national recovery and resilience plans, to adjust them according to the needs which have now come up because of the asymmetric shocks, which countries are being hit. Second, to use the loan capacity of Next Generation EU. We should not forget that the loan capacity has not been used by member states, so there is still a capacity to use that. And the third thing, at some point, potentially, we might also have to think about something which goes beyond Next Generation EU in terms of showing solidarity with those hit most by the longer term effects of the crisis. And we cannot make that assessment at this present point in time, but we still already start thinking about that potential avenue in future. With respect to Germany, and that links to something which Herman said in his initial remarks when he was talking about the situation becoming more difficult. I think what we need to look at is not only at the question as to whether the united front among the EU 27 is crumbling, on which issues potentially it is crumbling, but also to look into the debates within the member states. And that is where you can see that there is movement, that things are changing. And in the German debate, it is now predominantly, it is very much dominated by the discussion about heavy arms. And this is something which is dividing the country into 2. 45% saying we need to provide heavy arms as much as we can. We need to follow what the Americans are doing. We need to support Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves, to defend the future of their country, the sovereignty of their country. And 45% saying we need to be careful because by providing heavy arms, we might be dragged into this conflict. We might be dragged into a world war, maybe even a nuclear war. And they are arguing providing heavy arms makes the situation more dangerous. And I think that is the wrong argument, but I'm just laying it out as it is, as it's being stated. And it could also make the suffering of the Ukrainian people more difficult, which I think is a sarcastic way of arguing, because at the end of the day, it's the Ukrainians themselves who have to decide how far they want to go and how far they are willing to defend themselves, and they need support in that. So you see the division within Germany is now along these two lines, and the government is struggling with that. And the government is also struggling with that because the leadership of the governing, Chancellor Scholz, in the beginning had been extremely hesitant. He had always been to be pushed from the outside, but also from within his own coalitions, the Greens being the most pushy ones, the FDP being rather silent. Side remark, the party of Genscher being silent when it comes to foreign policy issues the way they have been is remarkable. So we see these differences within society, within the government, and that plays a particular role because it's Germany. And a lot of others are also potentially hiding behind the Germans. Once they were ready to support the oil embargo, you see how the climate change within the EU 27. So that is extremely important to watch what has continuously happened in Germany.
Thank you very much. We'll come back on France in a minute because I want to link it to something Macron said yesterday. But on your comment there about that debate within Germany, one of our audience, Nico Keppens, says, how can the EU find the balance between being a defender of the peace and soft power and replying to those who want a stronger army and weapons industry, basically selling weapons to others and hence, quotes, keeps wars going? To be in line with what it was set up for, shouldn't we, Europe, aim for the first, or is that impossible in the real world where power prevails? I think that really goes exactly to the question that you were raising. But Herman, I wanted to come back, and there is a question about the Conference of the Future of Europe. We'll come to the specifics of that later. But I really wanted to come back on this question of if we are close to the limits of what can be agreed unanimously. There is one specific call emerging from the Conference on the Future of Europe to move to QMV, but I see a lot of debate among EU leaders, among commentators and so on, saying even if you had QMV, this would not be a situation where you could use it. And we've had conversations in the past about the use of QMV with the migrant crisis in 4 or 5 years ago, whether that was productive or counterproductive, i.e. when you outvote a country on such a core issue for them. Do you think QMV, if we have reached the limits of what we can do at 27, or we may have, is the answer? I mean, obviously it's not going to happen overnight, but is, even if QMV would be the ideal answer, is it the politically realistic answer here? Some way of sidetracking or getting round one country blocking things? Mm-hmm.
For today's situation, of course, we have no QMV possible. So it's sanction has to be decided unanimously, otherwise you have no sanction at all. So for the future, you know, Jacki, that I hate ideological debates. So what can we do in a very pragmatic way? So for me, it's not about unanimity or QMV. Could also be, if we start on the path of treaty changes, then you have to look what kind of QMV. It shouldn't be necessarily the QMV that is now foreseen in the treaties. We can create something new, in the sense that it is unthinkable for me that in crisis situations, that 1 or 2 countries are blocking the European Union as a whole. So you can imagine a new kind of QMV preventing that such a thing is happening. We are with 450 million people in the European Union today with 27. So you cannot be blocked in times of war and peace, life or death. You can't be blocked by 10 million. Even I am a citizen of a very small country. It is unthinkable that one country, in case Belgium, to choose a neutral example, is blocking all the rest of the union. 1 or 2 countries, they cannot prevent the rest of the union to go ahead. So we have to be creative and see if we embark on this changing the rules of unanimity, if you cannot have something very, very pragmatic to prevent that kind of situation. For the rest, I agree with what you are insinuating. I was not happy with what happened in 2015, the QMV on the repartition of refugees. I think at that moment it was not the most wise decision that the Council has taken. But now again, we are in we are in a very particular situation, or we can come in a very particular situation. We avoided it since the 24th of February, but we can come in such a situation that one country is blocking all the rest. That is intolerable, unacceptable, and that the treaties have to foresee something to escape from that kind of awful situation.
Thank you. Fabian, you wanted to come in.
I think this is very much in line with what Herman was just explaining, but I think what this situation actually calls for is not to look necessarily at the technical fixes first, but to first decide what is it we need to achieve. Why do we have to change the treaties? Why do we have to change decision making? And then we can see what methods are possible And it might well be that in some areas that is also something which can happen outside the framework of the European Union, in an intergovernmental framework, in an adjusted framework. So I think we shouldn't get stuck now on there is only one particular way of addressing this.
So that creativity
really
that Herman was talking
look at
about.
what are the objectives which we are trying to achieve. And in this case, we cannot have a situation where a single country can block progress of the Union as a whole. The other point I wanted to make is just to say that we do have a window of opportunity, and that's also coming back to the question of NATO membership of Finland and Sweden. At this moment in time, I don't think it is very likely that Putin is going to embark on further military adventures, because his army is already overstretched. It's already at the point where he's struggling to find enough troops, enough material to fight the war in Ukraine, let alone anywhere else. So we can make changes now in foreign policy, in security policy, in the way we make decisions. But that's a window of opportunity which is also going to close. So we better get on with it now and not postpone it to some future date when it's not going to happen.
Absolutely. I did want to just stay with this. We don't have time to talk about the conference on the future of Europe in detail today, but just as Schönlau asks, if we're talking about the difficult structural choices, the link between the Ukraine Zeitenwende and the conference on the future of Europe, he says, is obvious. It's not about quick fixes, but unanimity in many areas of policy addressing the consequences of Russian aggression sits uneasily with the current talk of the, quotes, EU ready to act. And we see 13 member states already saying we don't want treaty change. Will we lose the momentum of EU reform yet again, asks Justus. Janis, let me come to you on that, referring there when he talks about 13 member states, of course, to that position paper, saying we're not ruling out options, but nor do we want what they see as premature or unconsidered rush to, for example, form a convention. EPC's put out lots of publications this week on the Conference on the Future of Europe, including one on the way forward. Just to that point, and how you see whether this war is really adding impetus to those discussions in the Conference on the Future of Europe, or risk getting buried amidst that, because some people say we just don't have the political energy for that sort of long-term talk when we're focusing on the war. Where do you sit on that?
Yes, we might not have the political energy. Yes, we might, out of realism, argue that having treaty change at this present point in time is too difficult. We have other things which are more important. And yes, you can say that the conference did not attract a lot of interest. Even yesterday's final event on the conference didn't attract that much interest. And if you witnessed it closely, you witnessed the speeches. What was newsworthy at the end was not about reforming the European Union. It was about creating a European political community, which was one idea which Macron was mentioning.
We'll come back to that one in a moment.
But I'm just saying all this because I have come to the conclusion, and I have always been a realist when it comes to reforming the European Union, reforming the EU treaties, always arguing that at the end of the day, you will not have a majority or consensus in the Council to move forward. You will have problems in ratifying any kind of new treaty. But I have now come to the conclusion that the time has come that if we live in a new era, if actually the Zeitenwende means what Zeitenwende means, and that we should prepare ourselves for potential challenges in future, which might be even bigger than the one we are experiencing since the 24th of February. Herman was saying earlier, just imagine for a second what the situation would now look like if we would have someone else in the White House, if we would have a Trumpist in the White House, what we would have done following the 24th of February. So if we have similar challenges in future, which are challenges of war and peace, of life and death. Yes, I know I'm over dramatizing, but we now have a challenge which involves war and peace, and a war involves the lives of people, as Amanda has reminded us. If we are at that moment, and potentially in future we will find ourselves at similar moments, we have the responsibility to prepare ourselves for these potential moments, even if it's only to avoid these moments in future. Because if we're not ready, if we're not able to exert power and influence at the European, at the global level, then no one will take us seriously. And then things might be even worse than if we are not prepared for these potential worst scenarios you could think of. So I think we now have an obligation, but what we're doing, and I think that is a mistake, is that we're creating an opposition between the things we now need to do, the things we'll have to do in 3 months and 6 months times, and the longer term need to reform the European Union. For me, this is not a distinction we should make. It is a false dichotomy. We need both. We need to reform ourselves now. We need to respond to what's happening. We need policy reforms, but we also have to think more long-term in terms of how we further develop the European Union. And that is something which we need to think together. And that's something where I would hope that the conference, not the conference itself, but the conference momentum and what the conference is signaling would lead to something which is a process which leads us in the right direction. Do I see that momentum? I fear that I don't see it. And it's not only the 13 who signed the letter you talked about earlier. It's also the sign that Paris has gotten from Berlin, which is this is not the right time for a convention for treaty reform, which is opposing, by the way, what it says in the German coalition agreement, which was saying that the conference potentially should also lead, if necessary, to a reform of the EU treaties. So Berlin is not behind that.
And opposing what Emmanuel Macron and Draghi have also said. So Italy and France are open to the possibility of a convention. Amanda, I'm going to come back to you in a minute about that issue of the European political community and enlargement and Ukraine's application, but I did want to just give Herman a chance to respond on that point of what we heard yesterday on the issues, and we're sidetracking slightly from Ukraine for a moment, but we're not, because of the conversation we just had about QMV and unanimity. Herman, what is your reading now of, as we've said, we have France and Italy saying they're open to the possibility, Germany is opposed, and this letter of the 13, and a sort of typical EU institutional battle where the 13 seem to be saying the European Parliament has hijacked this process. All the, the right of initiative proposals, some of the things that are in there. This is the Parliament using the conference to play interinstitutional battle games and so on, and we're not going to do that. How do you read this, and can this process be salvaged, or are we doomed to get involved in another major interinstitutional crisis which loses sight of the original purpose of all of this?
Again, I'm also in this conscious of the sense of urgency, but also at the same time trying to find a way out and to be pragmatic. So the first thing we have to keep in mind that the most important thing we have also vis-a-vis Russia is our own unity, So unity is at the top of our political agenda. And then you have to ask yourself, if organizing in the midst of a crisis, and we don't see the end of the Ukrainian war, is this the right moment to organize disorganized disunity? So the convention is divisive in any case. So is this the right moment to create that disunity at the moment that we need unity? And therefore, I say, and that's an idea that that comes from a paper that I read yesterday from Janis and others, is this not the moment to ask wise men and women, because we always speaking about wise men, but now it's wise men and women, to make proposals to bring things forward in the European Union. I give you two examples. First is this unanimity rule and QMV, but I'm making some kind of proposal of a new kind of QMV. Is that not those wise men can, instead of discussing an overall change of the treaties, they can focus on some specific issues very much needed and on which there is a possibility of a consensus. I'm very cautious. A second example, we can discuss it later on in this update, is I was thinking at it yesterday evening. We have these famous words in the treaties: an ever closer union of people. What can we offer to Ukraine, to Moldova, to Georgia, and possibly to others? It could be an ever closer association of people. And building on the existing association agreements, which are free trade agreements, visa-free, we can add security in all this and so on. So can't we agree on something that is going in between membership and the current situation, for instance, with those three countries close to us via an association agreement? So those wise men and women, they can think about not the major treaty change, but on very specific treaty changes, and that and those treaty changes emerge from the debate created by the war and so on. This is also longer term, but not longer term in the say a complete overhaul of all the structures. That would be very divisive, but on points on which we can agree.
Thank you very much. And Amanda, your reaction there to what Herman is saying and this whole debate. I mean, we see enlargement coming back as a geopolitical issue in a way it hasn't for a long time. Herman's proposal and the idea that Emmanuel Macron was talking about yesterday, not a new idea, but a reformulation, a European political community, concentric circles, if you like, where you could have countries, and he even raised the prospect of the UK maybe being in an outer circle. One wonders whether they'd be remotely interested. But when it comes to Ukraine, do you think that is a potential solution, the sort of solutions Herman is talking about? And what about the Western Balkans reaction if that was to happen? I mean, presumably from their point of view, they would fear that membership is slipping ever further away if another intermediate relationship. So does this idea, though, of an ever closer association of peoples, is there something in that, something we could work with?
I mean, honestly, I think it would be perceived in Ukraine and elsewhere as, you know, a second-class option.
But better than nothing? Because, just to interrupt you, was Emmanuel Macron simply saying what everybody privately says when he said it will take years, if not decades, to actually join the EU? So it might be this or nothing. So sorry, I just wanted to get your thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, we all know it's going to take years for a country to join the EU. But I mean, if a country is ready to put in the necessary hard work to achieve that objective. I mean, for Ukraine, for example, I mean, I don't see the Ukrainians being interested in this second option. I mean, it's been called, you know, an EU which has a center and then a periphery, and these countries would be in the periphery. That's not the same as being a full member of the EU. So, I mean, I'm not convinced that there's going to be, you know, a lot of support from the applicant countries for this process. I mean, when it comes to the Western Balkans, I mean, I think it's slightly different because the Western Balkans are still viewed, I believe, you know, very differently to Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia. I mean, they're already candidate countries, they're already in the accession process. And I believe there's going to be a doubling down of the commitment to the Western Balkans after rather a long time of sort of, you know, allowing them to, you know, go off in different directions or to lose the reform momentum thanks to fatigue in the EU. I think there will be a doubling down of commitment to the Western Balkans, but I don't think we're going to see the same thing towards Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, which is a mistake. I mean, Ukraine, Zelensky has submitted his, you know, 5,000 pages, the answers to this questionnaire. Ukraine is expecting to get a candidate country status, you know, if not before the summer, then by the end of the year. So I'm not sure that, you know, some alternative periphery membership or partial membership is a very attractive prospect because, I mean, at least for Ukraine, European integration is viewed as a soft security guarantee. And this is really important. I mean, it's not the only reason, but it's a crucial reason why it's important that they stay on this, you know, track one process.
Thank you. Janis, you wanted to come in, and then Fabian. Briefly, if you would, because a couple of other issues I want to touch on before we close.
I think that we need a debate about different forms of belonging. This is not a new debate. We've had this, we have ideas about this for a long time. Even minor me being engaged in these kind of ideas 15 years ago and writing papers about this. And politically, we need to have this debate in order to showcase as to whether we mean what we say when we say that the door should be open to the European Union to countries like Ukraine, but also to make sure that what we have promised to the countries of the Western Balkans becomes a reality. So if we have that discussion about different forms of belonging, staged membership, which are, by the way, are not alternatives to full membership. It's a way potentially to move closer to the EU before you acquire the rights and obligation of being a full EU member. If you have that debate, you have more of an honest debate about actually, are you ready to enlarge the European Union, which, by the way, links to our previous discussion, because if you actually want to enlarge the European Union, you also have to reform the European Union, because both go hands in hand. The EU as it is, if it would enlarge by 2, 5, 7 member states, how could we be able to operate on the basis of where we are now? So the enlargement and deepening debate are two sides of the same coin. So I think we need to have that debate in order to put pressure on the EU to actually showcase as to whether they mean what they're saying, plus also showcase those who want to join the European Union as to whether they're ready to do the reforms which are necessary for them to be able to join the club. So I think that is why politically it's necessary. But at the end of the day, I remember when we had these discussions in the past, there were two main reasons which were always said, go against it. And plus the external reason, which Amanda already mentioned, meaning that it wouldn't be attractive from the perspective of those who want to join. And those who are in the club were saying, how do we deal with money and how do we deal with decision making, and in which way are they involved, or are they not involved when it comes to these issues? So there are a lot of obstacles on the way to having different forms of belonging, but I think we need to have that discussion, because enlargement has become again a strategic imperative.
Exactly. Fabian.
Yeah, I think following on from that, I think what has to be clear is that this is not just an excuse to say no. Because in the end, this is still what is going through the minds of many people, that we have to find a way of saying no, which doesn't sound like no. And for me, there's a warning sign there, having the UK in this framework, because here we have a country which clearly has no aspiration whatsoever of becoming an EU member. By putting them in some way on the same kind of structure, the same kind of circles, as countries which clearly have as their final wish full membership of the European Union, I think that's a very bad signal. So if this is designed as a process which can bring countries in gradually because they can't move quickly, then that's one thing. But if it becomes a permanent parking place for countries which we can't allow in because frankly we haven't reformed ourselves, then this is a very bad signal. And the other point I want to make, I think with Ukraine, we have to have a special consideration. Ukraine has earned itself the right to be heard, but not only that, we also have to consider what is going to be the architecture for Ukraine in the aftermath of this war. Because it's not going to be NATO, at least all the indications are at the moment that that is not going to be the security structure. And if I look at, for example, limitations in countries like Germany, I think the only way we can have a meaningful security structure is through the European Union. But that would entail membership, not some kind of outer circle which doesn't have the same rights and obligations. So I think we have to have a much more in-depth discussion, which also touches on some of the taboos which are there. And that we do have to consider that in the end, and that's coming back to my point before, we should be looking at what is the end point? What are the objectives we're going to have to get to? In the end, Ukraine has to be a member of the European Union. So let's now talk about how we design that process of how we get there, how quickly that can happen, but that has to be the end point.
Thank you. Just want to spend 2 minutes, 5 minutes on strategic autonomy and what impact the war is having on that debate within the Union, and would like to also particularly get Herman's thoughts on relations with the US and with China now. But on strategic autonomy first, and perhaps talking first about strategic autonomy in its strictest sense, that of defense and military capabilities. Do you think, you said earlier, Herman, the political courage, there is some political courage out there in this area, the area of military capabilities and the EU, it's brought NATO back to the fore, as we know, and the purpose of NATO, it's reminded everyone of its importance. Do you think it's also going to give impetus to strategic autonomy in defense and see real cooperation in building military capabilities?
Mm-hmm. There is this new commission paper, the so-called Strategic Compass. It's an interesting document, but the question remains, and you put the question, is there enough political will to implement this? When you look at the different chapters, it's all about cooperation, not only between the armies, but also between the industries and so on and so on. So, but we know what has to be done. Without the stigma of a European army and without being disconnected from NATO. So it's up to the member states now, and they feel what the impediments are today to fully help Ukraine. They see there's a huge discrepancy still between the possibilities of the United States to deliver weapons and to give real support, and compared to that of the Europeans. So everything is on the table. Everything is on the table. It depends on really on the political will and the political courage. And for sure, and I come back to this, if in 2 years' time, or in a few years' time, there is again a switch in American policy, which is not excluded. Of course, I'm hoping, praying that it will not happen. But we have to keep it in mind. We have to keep it in mind. So strategic autonomy, also in defense, although we are still hugely dependent on NATO, and that means on the United States, how can we nevertheless create our own defense industry? How can we create our own defense capability without falling into this dream of a European army?
Absolutely. Balance, that balance you keep talking about here more than anywhere. Amanda, a thought on this, and then I'd also like to widen this to economic strategic autonomy as well. I'll come to Fabian and Janis on both of those. Amanda.
Yeah, I mean, I more or less agree with what Herman was just saying. I mean, I think it's really important that EU member states take more responsibility for their own defense and security, which is why I hope that the strategic compass isn't just going to remain on a shelf gathering dust, that it's actually going to be implemented. I mean, we're in a new era now. I mean, the security framework that existed for many decades has actually come to an end. But this didn't just end in February 24th. I mean, this actually ended back in 2014. It's just that Europeans, weren't smart enough back then to accept the fact that old security architecture had disappeared and that we needed to start to build something new. So this is something that needs to begin, ASAP. But I also think that in addition to this, traditional defense and security, we also need to give more focus to nuclear deterrence capabilities, because as far as I know, the EU doesn't have at the moment any sort of realistic strategy in terms of the nuclear option, because we can't take it for granted or not granted at all. I mean, there is a chance that the Russians could use nuclear weapons. This needs to be taken seriously in addition to chemical weapons, and there needs to be much more focus on how we would deal with that. And this includes developing a proper nuclear deterrence, which doesn't currently exist.
Thank you. just broadening this out, Janis, also to the issue of strategic autonomy when it comes to the economy, and a question that Herman raised in a recent speech he gave at an EPC event when he talked about our commitment to multilateralism. But he also said, and I'll come back to you, Herman, in a minute and link this to our relations with the US, he said, you know, we have to do this in a way that doesn't spill over into protectionism. Do you think there is genuinely more impetus for economic strategic autonomy now because of the war in Ukraine? And how are we going to get that line right, do you think? I know it's a big question, and I'm going to ask you to be horribly brief because we're coming to the end of time. I apologize, that's the nature of update, bit of a whistle-stop tour around these issues. Janis.
I think, yes, there's more momentum with respect to the need for economic strategic autonomy. There's also more debate. But when it comes to what is happening since the 24th of February and the economic war we are having against Russia, it's rather easy because Russia, in economic terms, is a very small economic player. Whereas the real answer to Europe's strategic autonomy still has to be decided, not vis-a-vis Russia, but vis-a-vis how we position ourselves as Europeans, vis-a-vis other global economic actors of a much bigger magnitude. And obviously China is the first that comes to mind. And we're having the beginning of a debate of what the implication of the experience of today potentially might mean in our future relationship with China. Not that we want things to develop in a negative fashion, but what happens if they would develop in a negative way? And how would we then make sure that we are autonomous enough to be able to deal with such a potential economic worsening of our relationship with China, if that, when that, and I'm not saying it should, but if it would happen. So there's a lot of debate that still has to happen. Let me just add one thing to the discussion we had on strategic autonomy in the area of defense. And I agree with what has been said. We know what we have to do. We have many ideas in our drawers for a long time. We're not implementing them. The strategic compass is a document that was revised in view of what happened in Ukraine. But when it comes to key projects and deliverables, it is not concrete, and member states are not ready to become very concrete. So I have my doubts as to whether what Amanda rightly is saying will materialize. Will we be actually smart enough now to take the right lessons of what we're seeing in front of our eyes in order to prepare for the future? We didn't do, as you reminded us, Amanda, we didn't take the lessons of 2014 serious enough. Will we actually take the lessons of today serious enough? And by the way, Europe might be confronted after 24 with even more of a challenge if the security of Ukraine and others will largely depend not only on NATO, but also on the EU partially. So the test for the EU is still ahead.
Okay, Fabian, quick one if you would.
Yeah, I think the key for me is not really about this ideological debate between protectionism or openness, but really it's recognizing that we live in a world now where the politics or the geopolitics have to come first and the economics come second. So yes, in some areas, it will mean that we will have more closed markets, that we will be less able to trade freely. But this should be an assessment we make, and we should be very clear about why it is necessary in that particular area to act in that way. That will entail costs as well, and then we have to be also clear who is going to bear those costs. We can't just pretend that this comes for free. Strategic autonomy will require an investment. But in the end, what this is about is to assess our geopolitical, geostrategic vulnerabilities and then to address them in whatever sector that is.
Thank you. I'm just going to give you a warning before I ask Herman one last question that I'm going to ask you at the end in less than 30 seconds each. I want to come back to something Janis said at the beginning when he said, I hope that we won't be saying in 7-8 years' time, we should have drawn the lessons from what happened in 2022 and we didn't. What for you is the biggest lesson we should draw? I'm giving you heads up so you can think about it and give me a very succinct reply in a moment. But Herman, on this question, and it does link the debate about strategic autonomy and the relationship with the US, because you have argued again in recent speeches that this is a moment to really build that relationship. And you've talked about it, or strategic autonomy being part of making it a truly balanced partnership. What does the EU need to do now? And one word, if you would, on China.
Yeah, on strategic autonomy, it's becoming now the key concept of the European Union. By the way, we spoke about the Green Deal before the 24th of February as the main objective of the European Union. Now it's about strategic autonomy. Footnote, the de-Russification of energy can also mean for the European Union the decarbonization of our energy policy. So there are a lot of opportunities also. So this is becoming the key concept in a range of areas. In view of what happened vis-à-vis Russia, in view also on the new relationship we have with the United States, but keeping always in mind that we are living in democracies. So President Biden is not there forever, but we have to seize this opportunity to strengthen the transatlantic relationship and work on what was left by President Obama, the unfinished work, and you shouldn't call it with those words, the unfinished work on the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. So we have to work on it. I know that the world has changed, but now it is really, we are really convinced that the West needs also infrastructures, strong infrastructures, so that if there is a change in the United States, those institutions, those agreements can remain.
And one word on China.
China is a partner, still on climate change. China is a competitor, and they have to respect the rules of the World Trade Organization. So we need fair trade with them. But China is also a systemic rival. That are the words of the European Commission and the European Council, and they are more realistic than ever. China, I think that they are extremely unhappy with the war in Ukraine. That's my assessment. But they cannot confess that they will take side in this conflict, and taking side means taking the side of the West. So they are in those untenable situations that they become, and for us, it's absolutely something that we have to not only to take into account, they become the friends of our enemies. That doesn't mean that China is an enemy, but they are becoming the friends de facto, implicitly of our enemies. So we have to draw all the conclusions from this, and they have also to consider this new situation. Absolutely. They are not really aware about all the consequences of the Ukrainian war on the EU-China relations.
Sure, we're going to come back to this in future times, but we are almost out of time. I'm going to go round. Going to start with Fabian, then go to Janis, then go to Amanda, and then Herman. In a sentence each, what is the biggest lesson that we need to draw now so we don't say in 9 years' time we should have drawn it then? Janis.
I think it sounds simple, but it's something we discussed over the past more than 1 hour, is prepare ourselves for a situation where we will have to defend ourselves in a way which we thought is no longer necessary. And if we don't prepare ourselves for that moment, and Fabian was talking about geopolitics is more important than the economy, that moment will be about an issue of war and peace, and it will be about life and death. And I would want us to be prepared for that moment, not to fight, but in order to prevent it, because by preparing ourselves is the best way to prevent it.
Thank you. Fabian.
As we've said before, this is a watershed moment or a Zeitenwende. And we're now at the crossroads where we have to decide whether we make the right decisions, whether we learn the consequences from this, or whether we fall back to what we had before, where we fragment, where we essentially go back to letting the member states do whatever they think is the right thing to do. If we do that, we condemn ourselves to irrelevance. We condemn ourselves to not being able to defend our values and interests. But this is a choice, and we have to make the right choice now.
Thank you. Amanda.
Yeah, no more appeasing of Russia ever. Back in 2014, when Russia annexed and occupied Crimea, Ukraine was told, don't respond. When Russia started a war in Donbass, and the final ceasefire agreement that was negotiated by the EU was something that wasn't very favorable to Ukraine. So the lesson here should be no more pushing Ukraine into doing things it's not comfortable with, no more making Ukraine do concessions or have flexibility. We need to stand 100% with Ukraine and never again appease the Russians.
Thank you very much. Herman, you have the last word. I know you hate my questions where I ask for one big lesson, but if you could identify one, what would it be?
Oh, the world is, and what I'm now saying is really a commonplace. The world since February 24 is completely different compared to even all what we lived through since 2008. We spoke often in the EPC about a multiple crisis. This is much more than just a crisis. The world is completely changing, and we have to reinvent ourselves in this new world. I think, and I'm trying to be as positive as possible, I think we covered a lot of ground, to use your word, Jacki, since the 24th of February. Now comes the most difficult period. Not only about sanctions, but also on delivering weapons, for instance. So this is the crucial weeks ahead, and I will not drawing conclusion on the longer term. We already spoke about strategic autonomy and so on. But on the short term, it's about the survival also of a part of Europe that belongs to us in some way or another. But I fully agree with those who are saying Ukraine, one day or another, will become a member of the European Union. That's not the problem is in what kind of stages we are and how we keep the European Union united. Because what our enemies are asking and we are hoping for is our disunity. So let us not put things on the forefront. There is no chance that we get a united position. Yet let us fight with those arms and behind those positions on which we all agree, we courageously agree, but which we all agree. And the main message, we acted in a united way. Let's continue to act in a decisive and united way.
And on that note, thank you so much for a really great discussion. I'm really very grateful to you, and we have tried to cover far too much ground, but it is the nature of this crisis that it has so many facets that need discussion. Thank you particularly to you, Herman, as always, for being with us and for your commitment and for your wisdom. Thank you, Amanda. Always great to have you with us, and gentlemen, Janis, Fabian, always lovely. Just to mention before we go, the EPC has published a number of publications over the last few days relating to the Conference on the Future of Europe. There's a commentary today by Andrew Duff on how to trigger treaty change. There's a paper on under construction, citizen participation in the European Union, multiple EPC authors. Also, I mentioned it earlier, after the Conference on the Future of Europe, moving into a new era, a blueprint, a timeline for what could, what should happen next, also multiple authors, and another paper on the conference from citizens' recommendations to EU policy. Do look all of those up on the website if you haven't seen them, and watch out for events this week following up on the issues and going into more detail on a couple of the issues we've been talking about. Tomorrow there is one on the German Zeitenwende, a word we've all now become familiar with, even if we're not German speakers, the implications for Europe's security architecture. And on Friday, an event on the war in Ukraine, Western sanctions on Russia, effectiveness and impacts. And I'll be back later on this month, at the end of the month, with another EPC update after the next summit. So thank you all very much. I wish you a very pleasant rest of the day. Thank you so much for joining us. and see you again next time. Bye-bye.